and then for anybody else who joins or sees the recording, that's awesome. So my name is Matt Pisera, certified financial planner, among other things. Super excited to be with the Parks Place Iranian-American Community Center again. As some of you, and those of you who are on the call, obviously just heard me talk about. My wife, Donna Mogadam, is Persian, and I've had the pleasure, I will say, of kind of being a part of that community and learning more about the Persian culture and things like that. So I'm super excited to talk about risk management, specifically for young professionals this evening. As we go through, I will say for those of you who are on the call, ask questions as we go. This is, pretty informal as far as, my presentation style. But I wanted to make sure that for those of you who do join, when we think about planning for our finances, we are not taking for granted some of the less exciting but equally important components of financial planning, and that is kind of the risk management side of things. So again, my name is Matt Pisera, founder of Aether Financial Group, where we do comprehensive financial planning, locations here in the DC area, as well in Orlando, and looking forward to getting going. So disclosures, which I'll pull back up later, but what are we going to talk about today? So first thing that we're going to address is more or less defining the concept of risk and risk management in the context of financial planning, and how it relates to different areas of your financial life. So we're going to go through that on a very basic level, just so that we are talking about the same thing or understanding what that looks like. Then we're going to go into four areas, specific areas of risk management that I think are maybe not prerequisites, but that's a word that I'll throw out there, prerequisites to some of the more exciting saving, investing, and other things that you typically think about whenever you hear, finance. So those categories that we'll talk about are emergency funds, debt management, insurance planning, which we'll kind of break out into a couple different categories, and then the basics of estate planning. So we'll go over all of those in a bit more detail, with what I'm sure will be plenty of time for question and answer at the end. But as I said, please feel free to ask questions as we go by either raising your hand on Zoom, unmuting, whatever is most comfortable for you. I'm good with it. So what is risk? So risk is the potential for harm or loss. Potential for harm or loss. And there's a lot of different ways that can manifest in your finances. And risk management is proactively identifying what those potential areas of risk are and taking some steps to mitigate them. And so in some cases that will be to transfer the risk. Insurance is a really good example of that. In some cases, it might be to minimize, to kind of reduce the impact that a potential risk could pose. An emergency fund is a good example of that. Sometimes it's avoidance, right? Risk avoidance would just be don't do certain activities that lead to a certain type of risk. But specifically to young professionals, the reason that this topic is so important is, by definition, you're just getting started. Now, you might be, kind of middle, early middle career. So young professional doesn't mean, hey, this is my first job out of college. That could mean, hey, I'm early 30s, maybe even early 40s. But it implies that we haven't had as much time to build our savings, to establish a plan forward, and we've got a lot of what we call working capital. So we have a lot of years of earning potential in the future that we haven't had the opportunity to enjoy just yet. And so those things lead themselves to being a bit more vulnerable, if something goes wrong in our financial lives. So this process of risk management and risk management planning, promotes stability in your financial circumstances. It kind of avoids what could be some really unpleasant circumstances. And it also allows you to bridge certain situations that could otherwise be pretty financially devastating. So we'll talk about all those different things. But that's the premise of why this applies and why we talk about this. So the first thing that we're going to address is an emergency fund. And for most people, this is kind of the first step. It's kind of a de facto step in risk management planning, is to build an emergency fund. And many of you are probably familiar with that term. So an emergency fund is a savings account, so safe, liquid account that is earmarked for unexpected, financial situations. So this is not your regular checking and savings where you pay your bills every month out of. This is a separate allocation of money that is set aside in case, we become unemployed, in case, the AC breaks, in case the roof leaks, in case we need something done. We have this money set aside that will help to bridge some sort of a gap. Now, the typical emergency fund, this is something where I think mainstream financial news has done a pretty good job of promoting awareness around with one small tweak. Emergency fund is typically 3 to 6 months of expenses, of monthly expenses, not income. So it doesn't really matter how much money you make when you're planning your emergency fund. It really has to do with what are your bills. And so the idea here is giving yourself that buffer where if income is reduced, we are between employment, we are taking a hiatus for some reason, whatever the case may be, we've got enough money to bridge the necessary gap that represents. Now, the 3 to 6 months is a rule of thumb. It's a pretty good rule of thumb for the majority of people, but your circumstances will dictate whether you should be at the lower end of that threshold, whether you should be at the higher end of that threshold, or whether you should be, maybe in a different category with 12 months or potentially more. So the things that we look at there are going to be job stability, right? So there's a big difference between a real estate agent whose income is kind of lumpy and it may not be the same every month versus a teacher with tenure, right? So teacher with tenure, very secure, probably going to be okay with 3 months, 3 months of living expenses. Real estate agent, variable income, subject to housing market conditions, might want 12 months of income in case it's a bad year or something to that effect. And then there's all the kind of gradation in the middle. And so what kind of work you are in, and then your personal comfort level with instability will also guide how much you should have in an emergency fund. If you are maybe a little bit more risk averse, you probably want a little bit more in your emergency fund. If you are maybe a little bit more risk on, you might lean towards a lower threshold. And again, because this money in your emergency fund is safe. It's not designed to grow. It's not invested. It's not subject to volatility. It is intentionally losing to things like inflation because the whole point is we can access it quickly without any risk of it not being there. So high yield savings accounts, CDs, bank accounts, those are really good examples. Money market accounts would be good examples of where that emergency fund probably lives for most people. So next up, debt management. So for a lot of young professionals, this is a pretty salient topic where, it could be that we're coming out of school with student loans. It could be that we've maybe accumulated a little bit of credit card debt as we've gotten started or just haven't really, established a really good cash flow management technique thus far. And so managing debt and making sure that debt gets addressed in the right order is another really important prerequisite to saving and investing. So on a very high level, we do break this down into what, we consider good debt and bad debt. So good debt usually has a positive purpose behind it, right? So, it contributes to our lifestyle in some way. And it's usually more modest in terms of what interest rate it carries. So something like a mortgage would be considered good debt. We don't all have, the money lying around to buy a house in cash. And so the taking on of mortgage debt promotes, our ability to buy a home and, experience that from both a financial perspective and from a personal satisfaction standpoint. And so having mortgage debt is not a bad thing. Now you want to be conscious of what the environment for interest rates is. Buying a house 3 or 4 years ago was a much less expensive experience than it would be today. But that's not important necessarily. What's important is that you are, at the time that you're buying, you are at or at a market interest rate. So today's market interest rate is probably, hovering right around 7%. That's more than it was in the past, but that's irrelevant. We didn't buy a house in the past. And so we just want to make sure that we are in line with what is currently going on. So something like a mortgage, that's good debt. We are not usually in a hurry, from a financial planning perspective, I should say. We're not in a hurry to pay off that debt as a priority item, because that's not bad debt to carry. It's owning an asset. That asset is appreciating, and like you say, you'd have to separate with a lot of cash in most scenarios to pay it off. Contrast that with like credit card debt. Credit card debt is usually not good debt. Typically very high interest rates, usually a sign that there's an imbalance in your cash flow. So when you take on credit card debt, it usually means you're living, without outside of your means, in many cases. And so we want to be really conscious about how we use our credit cards. And if we do have credit card balances, we want to pay them off, and we want to get in the habit of paying our credit cards off at the end of every month. One of the really important concepts around debt is you always need to keep in mind that the amount of interest that you are paying is, a negative rate of return, I guess is maybe the easiest way to say that. So if I think that I can earn 10% in the market or 7% in the market, which is what the S&P 500 will do over the long term, 7 to 10%, but I'm paying 20% on a credit card, I'm losing to that credit card interest every single month. And so I need to be really conscious about how much high interest debt I am taking on at any given point. So just kind of going back through this list, student loans, right? So this is not typically bad debt, but this is usually debt that people are eager to get rid of. And so understanding what your options are, whether you have federal loans or whether you have private loans, are you on an income-based repayment plan? Are you eligible for some sort of forgiveness program potentially? Those will all make sense. Do you want to pay that loan off over 10 years? Do you want to stretch it out over 20 years? Do you want to stretch it out over 20 years, but pay it like a 10-year or a 5-year? That's a really underrated concept for most people. But we want to make sure that we're not carrying excessive amounts of debt. If we do have student loans, if we do have auto loans, we need to kind of measure, do we take on more debt, or do we wait until we paid off some of this to add, a mortgage or something to that effect? So that's debt in a nutshell. Thinking about how, from a more tangible standpoint, do we potentially address the debt? There's different strategies, different tactics that you can potentially employ. So budgeting or cash flow management is kind of at the core of everything in financial planning. How much money comes in and then how much money goes out, it, drives what you are actually able or not able to potentially do. So having an understanding or an awareness of cash flow and budgeting is super important. And I think budgeting, has kind of become a restrictive word. We associate it with, I don't get to enjoy my money. And that's really not what it is. It's just about knowing where your money goes. And then from my vantage point, it's about aligning where your money goes with what your actual values are. Because a lot of us just get into the habit of spending in certain, patterns. And sometimes if we actually took a step back and realized, hey, I'm spending money on things that I don't actually care about that much, that might be something worth addressing. Looking at snowball and avalanche as two concepts that you can use to pay off your debt. The snowball approach says I'm trying to gain momentum. So I'm trying to look for wins early on. And so what that means is that if I have multiple categories of debt, I'm going to pay off the smallest dollar amount first. So if I've got 3 credit cards, one has $500, one has $1,500, and one has $5,000. In the snowball approach, I'm going to pay off the $500 card first and get rid of it completely, and thereby, use that momentum to then tackle the 1,500, then the 5,000. Okay, so a snowball approach says smallest dollar amount first. The avalanche approach says I'm going to pay off the highest interest rate first. So regardless of what the actual dollar amount of debt is, I'm going to take whatever my highest interest rate debt is, and I'm going to allocate all of my excess cash flow for debt management to that highest interest rate card, because theoretically, that's the one that's quote unquote hurting me the most. Okay, so snowball approach is smallest dollar amount. Avalanche approach is highest interest rate. A lot of research would suggest that the snowball approach, has some legs behind it, so to speak. But you really have to do the one that you're going to stick to. So whichever one's going to make you feel better about your repayment plan, that's really the number one consideration in all of this, is what are you going to continue to do on a regular basis until the quote unquote problem is fixed. And then consolidation, that's a strategy where you could say, you know what, forget snowball, forget avalanche. Maybe I have the opportunity to consolidate this into, instead of multiple loans, maybe I'm now going to cut this back into one consolidated loan, potentially at an averaged out interest rate. You can also look at like credit card transfers if it's credit card debt, where, maybe you're moving it onto a card that has 0% interest for a period of time. That's a good strategy. But understanding your cash flow, using your cash flow, again, whether it's snowball, avalanche, or some other combination of, that's how we would kind of more tangibly address the debt. And then tactics. So tactics are going to refer less to the mechanics of how we pay down the debt and more to the mechanics of how do we influence cash flow. So how do we influence our budgeting so that we can pay off our debt in a more efficient manner. And so one is, and these are, I will self-acknowledge, easier said than done in certain cases, but increase income. So do I have the opportunity to work extra hours? Do I have the opportunity to take on projects at my, current job? Do I have the opportunity to, work a part-time job for a stint, right? This is not necessarily permanently changing your entire life. This is just saying, hey, if I have a debt issue, do I need to, maybe make some lifestyle adjustments to address that in the short term? So potentially increase income, cut expenses. Most of us have a little bit of room where, we're spending, on things that we don't necessarily need to spend on rather. In that regard, there is a balance. We want to be really realistic about this. Cutting expenses is important where necessary. We want to be responsible with our money. Sometimes we might need to be more responsible than we really want to be with our money. But we also don't want to we don't want to sour our entire relationship with money by taking all of the enjoyment out of our incomes. And so you do want to cut expenses. You do want to be responsible. You do not want to completely deprive yourself of every, small luxury that you may indulge in. Negotiating with creditors, that's another one. It's in line with consolidation and with, credit card transfers, but depending on the type of debt, depending on the institution, you may be able to negotiate some of your debt. Like medical debt would be a good example of that, where, a lot of times there's opportunities to negotiate and have some of that, forgiven or reduced or whatever the case may be. And then, I think this one kind of goes without saying, but avoid taking on new debt to the best of your ability. So if you already have a debt challenge, making sure that you're not adding to it before you've addressed what's already out there is important. So that's our debt management kind of component. But like I say, having your arms around specifically bad debt, having your arms around bad debt, having a plan for good debt, that opens up the door to do a lot more in the investing world and things of that nature. So next we move into insurance planning. Insurance planning is a fairly broad category, so we're not going to explore every nook and cranny of this particular topic, but I am going to touch on some of the more germane categories to young professionals and really to a lot of the population. So health insurance is one. You know, have to have it. You know, most of us get it through our employer if we're, you know, fortunate enough to be in that position. Um, some of us may get our health insurance through the exchange, or if we're self-employed, that might be kind of a path that we go. When we think about health insurance, again, most of us don't have, for lack of a better way to phrase it, a ton of control over what that health insurance coverage actually looks like. So in the health insurance space, the most important thing is awareness. So I need to understand what am I at risk for? What is the insurance company covering? And so the biggest components of that are going to be things like deductibles, co-insurance, and out-of-pocket maximums. Now, for many young professionals, you know, we are fortunate enough where maybe our medical expenses are more modest, maybe not. And so understanding, you know, again, what does this actually look like, and how much am I exposed to, which would be your out-of-pocket maximum, is really important. Now, if you do have kind of routine medical exams or procedures that you partake in, knowing how much of those specific things your health insurance does or doesn't cover, medications, et cetera, that becomes really important. Property and casualty insurance. So property and casualty insurance is the, no pun intended, umbrella under which home, auto, renters, and umbrella insurance sit. So these are, you know, liability type coverages for the most part. And so homeowners insurance and renters insurance are protection of your, you know, homestead, you know, whether that's something that you own or that you rent. Auto insurance protects your vehicle, protects bodily damage, protects you from liability if you're involved in a crash, things of that nature. And then the one that doesn't necessarily get as much airtime is umbrella insurance. And so umbrella insurance is a type of policy that sits on top of your existing home, renters, or auto policies, and it provides you with additional liability coverage. And so umbrella policies are usually sold in $1 million increments, but they're very inexpensive. And so $1 million of umbrella coverage might cost $300, $400 a year. Now, again, this is usually for people who are in we see it a lot with physicians. So it's a very litigious profession to work in. And so if I work as a physician, whether I do or don't have a lot of money, the perception is that I do. And so if I'm involved in an auto accident, I might be more likely to get sued for higher dollar amounts than somebody who's in a perceived lower income role. But umbrella insurance is really good. Anytime we start to be in the position where we're accumulating assets, and maybe our standalone home, auto insurance, et cetera, it doesn't protect my full net worth. Umbrella insurance becomes a really cost-effective way to protect me from excess liability. But this is the same thematically. You want to understand your premiums, you want to understand your deductibles, you want to understand your coverage limits, so that you actually know what you're on the hook for and what you're not. Then we look at kind of the more personal and elective, I will say, insurances, which are disability insurance and life insurance. So disability insurance is oftentimes offered through our employer. Depending on our profession, that may or may not be adequate. But disability insurance replaces a percentage of our income in the instance that we are sick or unable to work. There's long-term disability, there's short-term disability. Short-term disability is usually 6 months or less. Long-term disability is usually 6 months or more. But these are designed to, again, replace a percentage of your income during those periods of disability. So when we evaluate disability insurance, we take a couple of things into consideration. Number one is the monthly benefit, usually stated as a percentage of income up to a maximum. So a very common group benefit that you might see through work with long-term disability is 60% of income up to $10,000 per month. Okay, so if I make $200,000 a year, 60% of my income is 120,000 or 10,000 per month. I am effectively using 100% of my employer-sponsored benefit. If I make more than that, that's whenever I may need private coverage. However, one of the really important things that we want to stress with disability insurance, especially the employer-sponsored disability insurance, is when your employer is paying the premium for the plan, which is often the case for group coverage, those benefits that you receive, that 60% of your income, is taxable. And so even though it's 60% of your income, it's 60% less the taxes that you owe on it. So your net replacement ratio might actually be pretty significantly lower. That implicitly is not good or bad, but it is something that you need to be aware of, because if you become disabled, unable to work, are relying on your benefits and realize, oh shoot, I've got to pay tax on this, it no longer satisfies my bills, that's something you want to know ahead of time, not to make light of it. Benefit period refers to how long those benefits will last for. So some policies will say you can collect benefits until age 65. So if you become disabled at 30, you can collect benefits until age 65. Some will say 5 years. So if I become disabled at 30, that doesn't solve the problem in the same way, which is why, again, especially for young professionals, because there are so many future earnings years ahead of us, we have to be conscious of what does my risk management look like for something like disability. If I become disabled young and that lasts a long time, what does that look like? Elimination period is the amount of time before the benefits become payable. And then the definition of disability, this again also relates to what kind of work we do. But broadly speaking, there are three definitions. There's any occupation, own occupation, and hybrid definition. Any occupation says you are disabled if you are unable to complete, if you're unable to work in any role for which you were reasonably trained or educated to do. Versus an own occupation says you are disabled if you are unable to complete the duties associated with the job you were actually doing before you became disabled. Again, there's a lot of good examples of this in the attorney world and in the physician or medical professional world, where what you are doing versus what you are trained for might be very different. You might be very narrow in terms of what you actually do, and it might be very broad in terms of what you were trained to do. And so, or even in like a technology type role, like if you are working in a certain capacity, for which you were trained to do a lot more than what you're actually doing, you want to know, well, if I can go, be an educator in the field that I was trained in, but I'm not necessarily going to make the same amount of money being an educator that I am in whatever field that I was trained in, is that going to preclude me from being able to collect on benefits? Hybrid definition would be a combination of the two, where it would say it's an own occupation definition. So if you can't complete your own job that you're actually doing right before you became disabled for 2 years, that's considered disabled. But after 2 years, it changes to an any occupation definition. And at that point, if you can go work in another profession for which you were reasonably trained, you're no longer considered disabled. So knowing what that definition is, especially depending on income level and how specific your role is going to be important. And then there are riders for private plans, typically not available on group coverage, but future increases. So can I increase my coverage as my income goes up? Am I capped? I kind of alluded to that in terms of what that increase would look like. Is my plan going to increase with inflation? What if I become partially disabled and only lose a percentage of my income? Does that count? How much does that count, et cetera? So a lot of different things to consider in the disability space, but to boil that down, making sure that if you become disabled, your benefits, whether they be group benefits through your employer or whether they be private benefits that you bought on a personal policy, or whether it be the combination thereof, are those benefits sufficient to support your lifestyle if you are not able to work? Right? That's what it boils down to. And then life insurance is another one, similar theme. So life insurance though is obviously for somebody else. So we need life insurance when there are people who are either financially dependent on our income or financially responsible for our debts. Those are the two big categories, right? So if I have no debts that would fall onto somebody else and I have nobody who's relying on my income, my need for life insurance is probably pretty negligible. I may want to have some coverage to support my family, through the grieving process. I may want to have a final expense policy, but that's not something that that we're typically planning around. That's a nice to have. However, if I'm married, if I have, financial dependents, if I have children for sure, if I have other people, if I have dependent parents, if I, think I'm going to have dependent parents in the future, those are the types of things where I'd say, you know what, if I pass away and I'm not contributing X dollars in income to, my household, what are those people going to do? That's the biggest driver of a life insurance need. And there are different types of life insurance. So there's term life, which is typically pretty inexpensive on a relative basis. It is a temporary solution. So a term life insurance policy has a timeline attached to it. And it says you are covered for X number of years at a level premium. Could be as little as 1, could be as much as 30 years. But I'm paying for life insurance for a temporary period of time, and I'm paying comparatively less relative to the other types of policies. They're not intended to be kept forever, but they are going to be less expensive than comparable coverage in a permanent policy. Then you look at permanent plans, which are different, and they say, hey, I've got life insurance forever. For as long as I live, I have the ability to keep my life insurance, and that'll come in a universal platform or a whole life platform. So for those of us who say, I've got financial dependence, or I have legacy goals, or I have life insurance needs that I just don't see going away in any reasonable timeline, I may want permanent life insurance to address that. Permanent life insurance can also feature a cash value, which would be what's considered a living benefit. So something that you can utilize as the insured while you're alive. It's not just a benefit to somebody else. The structure of that cash value would depend on the type of plan. It would depend on the carrier that you chose. It would depend on how important that feature was to you and how you built it. But again, at its core, you have temporary life insurance, you have permanent life insurance, and some of those permanent solutions will have cash accumulation savings inside of them, for lack of a better word. But determining the right amount of life insurance will largely depend on my financial circumstances, the people that are dependent on me, how dependent they are on me, etc. So that's the life insurance consideration. There are other types of insurances that we're not going to cover. There are things like long-term care insurance. There are specialty policies like cancer policies and things like that. Applying those to your personal circumstances is important. But as a young professional, making sure that at least these 4 categories of insurance planning are addressed and accounted for is probably going to be most advantageous to start. And then moving into the basics of estate planning. And in estate planning, I think for a lot of people, insights kind of a grandiose thought around, well, I don't have an estate. My estate's not that big. It's just me and my spouse, like whatever the case may be. But the reality is estate planning does apply to pretty much everybody. It's just to what degree and to what complexity level. And so, essence of estate planning is how are my assets potentially going to be distributed when I pass away? And it also refers to how are my affairs potentially going to be managed in the event that I am not able to do so completely on my own. So again, there's the what happens when I pass away. That's part of estate planning. But then there's also, what happens if I'm alive and unable to make decisions. That's also part of estate planning. So the benefits of estate planning, just kind of reading them off, making sure that assets are distributed the way that you want them to be. Okay, that's important. Potentially minimizing taxes. So even if it's just, the fact that you have a retirement account, like, are you thinking or do you care about the taxes that somebody else is going to be responsible for when they inherit it? Avoiding probate. So probate is a somewhat long process in certain cases, and it's also public. And so do I want my asset bequests to be, part of that process? Ensuring that people are taken care of, and then a healthcare decision. So again, that's going to be one that applies while we're alive. So the kind of core components of estate planning, not all inclusive. I am also not an attorney, and so you do need to have a legal professional to kind of help assist with a lot of these things. But at a very basic level, will and or a trust. So wills and trusts are, legal documents that allow for the allow for your wishes to be carried out in terms of the distribution of assets. So with a will, and then even more so with a trust, you have the ability to direct where certain assets go. What's important, and I guess I'll get to it when I get to updating beneficiaries, but what's important is that some assets bypass these things unless specifically listed. So life insurance is a good example. Retirement accounts are a good example. When you have life insurance, retirement accounts, etc., things where you name a beneficiary, it does not matter what's in the will. So in my will, I could say, hey, everything goes to my spouse. But if I never change my beneficiary on my 401k and it still has my parents listed, my spouse is not going to get that asset because the beneficiary designation passes outside of a will or a trust. Okay, so that's really important. So updating your beneficiaries, especially with life changes and changes in circumstance, that's critical because again, your will and or the fact that you're married or whatever the case, that doesn't solve every problem related to asset distribution. If you've got beneficiaries listed, they need to be updated. If you've got assets that, if you have them, and this is a little off topic, but if you have a more complex family dynamic and you haven't done this type of planning, the state decides what the order of operations is, and it may or may not align. It may or may not give all of the assets in the way that you would want them to be given. And so whether you're in Virginia, DC, Maryland, or somewhere else, every state, that information is public. You should know what that is if you haven't done this yet. And realistically, you should just do this so you don't have to worry about it. But then looking at the other ones, so powers of attorney, giving somebody permission or the legal capacity to make decisions on your behalf. Again, sometimes a spring power of attorney where it has to be triggered by a certain event. But it's important to make sure that, I have somebody who can access my financial accounts if I'm unable to do so, and I have the legal capacity to do it. Similarly, healthcare directives. So, a document that outlines how you'd like healthcare decisions to be made. And then again, somebody who can proactively make those decisions on your behalf. And then guardianship, if we have kids, who's going to take care of them? Do they know that? Do they have the proper, funding for that to tag team with life insurance in a really meaningful way, all that fun stuff. So again, estate planning, these are complex and these are issues with impact. It does not need to be big and scary though. You just need to make sure you address it and you address it with somebody who's kind of qualified to guide you through the process. Doesn't have to be super expensive. Again, really depends on your personal circumstances, but to the extent that you have anything that will pass to anybody, or will potentially have something that passes to somebody, or have somebody that will benefit from the passing of it to them, these are things that you do want to address. The other one would be just if you have, I don't know that anybody on the call will necessarily fit this bill, but if you have college age children who are technically adults, in the eyes of the law, having access to their medical information, might be something that you want to, plan for. So, proper healthcare disclosure documents for your adult children, especially before they're, maybe partnered off or have their own, contact people. So I guess that kind of takes us through the content that, I really wanted to cover today. So defined risk, kind of defined, what the impact is for young professionals, emergency funds, debt management, insurance planning, and estate planning. These are what we consider the foundation of financial planning. On these we build, and that's whenever we start to move more into the savings, the investing, some of the more exciting parts of financial planning. But as the saying goes, defense wins championships. This is important because especially with all the career that we have ahead of us as young professionals, we need to make sure that we don't get, kind of taken out of the game early. So, with that, I will open it up to questions if anybody has them. And if we have no questions, I will say thank you very much for your time. Always a pleasure to work with Pars Place. Should anybody have questions, comments, concerns that they would like addressed, feel free to reach out through any of the channels listed here. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn, all that fun stuff. Hopefully I'll be back to do a couple more talks like this, and we'll kind of continue the dialogue. But again, hopefully this information was helpful on some level, and we'll look forward to kind of continuing the process of education.